The palms on Palm Sunday aren't religious decoration. They're a public proclamation. Jesus enters Jerusalem as king, and the strongest part is this: the crowd gets the symbol right, but they still don't understand how that king is going to win. If you thought we use palms on Palm Sunday simply because it looks nice, because it's tradition, or because it's always been done this way, careful, because you're missing the most important part. The palm isn't there to decorate the procession. It's there to say something enormous about Jesus, and not just anything. The palm speaks of honor. It speaks of victory. It speaks of public recognition. It speaks of someone who enters and is received not as just another visitor, but as someone worthy to be acclaimed before everyone. So the question isn't only why we use palms. The real question is this: what is the crowd saying about Jesus when it receives him like this? And even more strongly, what is the church saying when she keeps that same gesture every year? Because we're not looking at a cute Holy Week custom here. We're looking at a symbol loaded with meaning. And if you don't understand it, you stay on the surface of the day and the heart of the moment slips right past you. Let's go to the center. We use palms on Palm Sunday because they are a sign of victory, honor, and public acclamation. With them, the crowd receives Jesus as Messiah and as King. The problem isn't the symbol. The problem is that many of the ones acclaiming him still don't understand what kind of king Jesus is, or how he is going to triumph. That's the drama. Look at the scene. Jesus enters Jerusalem. He doesn't enter hidden. He doesn't slip in unnoticed. He doesn't enter like someone trying to avoid the moment. On the contrary, he enters visibly, publicly, solemnly. People come out to meet him. They spread cloaks. They shout Hosanna. There's an atmosphere of expectation, enthusiasm, recognition. And in the middle of all that, the palms appear. That detail is not small, because a crowd doesn't wave a symbol like that just for folklore. It isn't an empty gesture. It isn't the first thing they found lying around. They're expressing something. They're making a proclamation. They're saying, this man is not just anyone. This man deserves honor. This man enters with royal dignity. This man represents a huge hope. In that context, palms don't function as decoration. They function as language. And that language has weight. They're not saying, we like Jesus. They're not saying, what a nice moment. They're not saying, let's do something emotional. They're saying something much bigger. We are receiving someone victorious, someone worthy of glory, someone who enters with an authority that deserves public recognition. That's why you can't understand this gesture if you reduce it to a childish tradition or a routine procession. There is a very serious claim here about who Jesus is. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because the crowd is right to honor Jesus, but they don't necessarily fully understand what they're doing. They see something real in him. They sense greatness. They sense a messianic moment. They sense that Jesus is not just another preacher. But one thing is to recognize something great, and something very different is to understand what kind of greatness it is. That's why the symbol is so powerful. In the ancient world, the palm was associated with victory, triumph, visible honor. It wasn't just any plant. It wasn't a neutral detail. It was a sign that communicated exaltation, recognition, public celebration. Which means the crowd isn't placing something generic before Jesus. They're using a symbol that speaks of triumph. And here comes the key question. If palms speak of victory, what victory does the crowd think it's seeing? Because that's the central tension of Palm Sunday. Many are expecting a visible, fast, powerful triumph in human terms. They're expecting a strong intervention. They're expecting a Messiah who changes the situation from the outside. They're expecting liberation in a language they understand. Force, political authority, historical greatness, national restoration. And Jesus is king. They're not wrong about that. What they still don't understand is how he's going to reign. Because Jesus doesn't enter Jerusalem on a war horse. He doesn't enter like a military conqueror. He doesn't enter with an imperial display of power. He enters riding a donkey. And that detail changes everything. Because right there you can already see, his kingship isn't following the logic of the world. He doesn't come to crush. He doesn't come to showcase violence. He doesn't come to dominate from above. He comes in humility. He comes in meekness. He comes with authority. Yes, but an authority of another order. And here is the real difference. The palms announce victory, and they're right. Jesus is going to win, but he's not going to win the way the crowd imagines. He's not going to win by defeating armies. He's not going to win by taking a palace. He's not going to win by imposing his strength. He's going to win by giving himself. He's going to win by obeying to the very end. He's going to win by passing through the cross. And that completely changes the meaning of the symbol. Because then the palms aren't wrong. They aren't out of place. What was incomplete was the crowd's expectation. They see victory, and they're not mistaken. What they still can't see is that this victory will take the shape of sacrifice. That's the tremendous irony of Palm Sunday. The crowd is holding a true symbol in their hands, but their understanding of the scene is still partial. They are receiving the king, yes, but they don't imagine that king will reign from the cross. And here's the most common mistake about this day: thinking the palms are a symbol of generic religious festivity, as if they simply represent joy, celebration, and Holy Week vibes. No, they're far more than that. The palms are the language of triumph applied to Jesus at the exact moment he is entering toward the Passion. That is much stronger, because then Palm Sunday stops being a gentle scene and becomes a scene charged with tension. The crowd acclaims Christ with symbols of victory, the same Christ who very soon will be humiliated, rejected, and crucified. And that clash isn't an accident in the story. It's the heart of the day. That's why the church keeps this gesture. Not because she likes repeating pretty scenes, not because she wants to put a symbolic object in people's hands and call it a day. She keeps it because a massive truth is condensed there. Jesus really is king, and at the same time, his kingship is only understood rightly when you look where he is heading, toward the cross. In fact, the church doesn't let you stay only with the procession and the palms. On Palm Sunday itself, she also puts the Passion in front of you, and that isn't there to ruin the celebration. It's there to stop you from reading the day superficially. It's as if the liturgy is telling you, yes, acclaim the King. Yes, recognize his glory. Yes, receive Christ with honor. But don't invent an easy triumph. Don't turn him into a king on your terms. Don't separate the palms from the cross, because if you do, you haven't understood anything. And that has enormous force. Because the church doesn't keep palms to soften Holy Week. She keeps them to open it to teach you from day one that Christ's victory does not look like the kind of victory we usually imagine, and that Jesus' glory does not oppose the cross. It is revealed through it. That's what makes this symbol so powerful. It isn't a decorative detail in the liturgical calendar. It is an anticipatory proclamation of a victory not yet fully understood. It is a gesture that says more than the crowd itself can grasp at that moment. It's a symbol that gets Jesus' greatness right, even if it still can't see the concrete form in which that greatness will be revealed. And here comes the most uncomfortable part. What happened with that crowd isn't just a biblical fact. It also mirrors us. Because we also want signs of quick victory. We also prefer a Christ who responds to our visible expectations. We also acclaim easily when God seems to confirm what we hope for. But when the path goes through the cross, through patience, renunciation, self-gift, obedience, we don't react the same way. We like the palm. The cross costs us more. We like a victorious Christ. A Christ who reigns through sacrifice unsettles us. We like the Messiah who enters acclaimed. The Messiah who lets himself be handed over and humiliated forces us to revisit too many things. That's why Palm Sunday is still so current. Because it doesn't only reveal who Jesus is, it also reveals what kind of victory we want. And there a very human temptation comes to light. Wanting glory without the cross, triumph without self-gift, the kingdom without deep conversion. But Christ does not enter that way. Christ enters as king, yes, but as a humble king. Christ enters as victor, yes, but as a victor whose full victory has not yet been shown in its complete form. Christ enters with honor, yes, but he enters toward the Passion, which means holding palms in your hand isn't enough. You have to understand what you're proclaiming with them, because if you treat the palm as just an object, you stay external. But if you understand what it means, that gesture stops being superficial. Then you're saying something serious. I recognize Christ as King. I recognize that true victory is in Him. I recognize that His entry into Jerusalem was not an empty scene, but the public manifestation of a different kind of kingship. And here's a very important detail. Saying we use palms doesn't mean the key is the botany of the object. The key is the meaning of the gesture. That's why even where palms aren't available and other branches are used, the symbolic logic still points to that solemn reception, that public acclamation of the Lord. What matters isn't the plant by itself, but what it represents liturgically and spiritually. And with palms, that language is very clear. Victory, honor, acclamation. Only Christ is going to fill that symbol with a depth the crowd doesn't yet fully see. That's why understanding this day changes all of Holy Week. If you understand why there are palms, you understand better why the church joins acclamation and passion in the liturgy. You understand better why Jesus enters publicly and humbly at the same time. You understand better that the cross will not be the unexpected failure of a beautiful project, but the path by which Christ will truly reign. And then everything fits better. You no longer see a pretty procession. You see a proclamation loaded with tension. You no longer see a cute tradition. You see a symbol that affirms Jesus' kingship. You no longer see just another religious atmosphere. You see the very threshold of Holy Week. And that really does change how you live Palm Sunday. Because living it well isn't just about going to get a blessed palm. It's about consciously entering what that gesture announces. It's about recognizing Christ as King, but not according to the world's logic. It's about accepting that His victory passes through self-gift. It's about not separating what the liturgy keeps united, the honor of the entry and the shadow of the cross. That's what makes this day great. It's not enough to raise the palm. You have to let that symbol correct you. You have to let it remind you that Christ didn't come to triumph the way the powerful triumph. He came to defeat sin and death in a much deeper way. And that's why the crowd, even though it's right to acclaim Him, still has to pass through the Passion in order to truly understand what kind of King has entered Jerusalem. So do we. Because one thing is to receive Christ with enthusiasm, and something very different is to follow Him when His kingship doesn't match our expectations. That's why Palm Sunday can't be understood if you separate the palms from the cross. The palms announce a real victory. The cross reveals what that victory consists of. One without the other stays incomplete. Together they show who Jesus truly is. So if someone asks you why we use palms and not another symbol on Palm Sunday, the answer isn't because it's tradition and that's it. The real answer is much stronger. Because with that gesture, the crowd recognizes Jesus as King and Victor. And the church keeps that sign to remind you that Christ's victory is real, but it passes through humility, self-gift, and the cross. That's the meaning. The palms don't decorate Holy Week. They inaugurate it with a proclamation. Christ enters as King. And that King will win, yes, but not the way the world expected. Tell me in the comments what the palms meant to you before this video, and subscribe to keep going deeper into the Catholic faith. See you in the next video.